A security dog bit a teen near his baby brother, but the father responded with federal charges that no one saw coming. A security dog bit the teen near his baby brother, thinking the father wouldn't react. He didn't realize the father was ready to bite back with federal charges. The moment teeth met skin, the cabin's balance of power flipped. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The hall felt ordinary, but every step forward tightened something unseen. Elias Rourke stood still in the middle of the arrival hall at Graymark Transit Hub, his body angled slightly forward as if bracing against a current no one else seemed to feel. The delay had stretched past midnight, and the terminal was crowded with exhausted travelers dragging bags, raising voices and jostling for exits. Overhead announcements echoed without pause, blending into a dull roar that pressed against his ears. Elias did not rush. He never rushed when his sons were with him. To his right, Nolan stood with his shoulders squared, 16 years old but already carrying himself with a careful seriousness. Micah slept against Nolan's chest, secured in a soft carrier, his small head resting beneath Nolan's chin. Nolan's arms remained locked around his infant brother, protective and deliberate, adjusting his stance each time the crowd surged too close. Elias watched this from the corner of his eye, pride and concern crossing his face at once. Nolan should not have had to learn this kind of vigilance so young. Elias's goal was simple: leave quietly, draw no attention, get home. He scanned the hall the way some people scanned traffic before crossing a street, noting patterns, distances, risks. That was when he saw the dog. The security canine moved along the edge of the crowd, muscles tight beneath its coat, head low, eyes tracking movement instead of threats. The handler, Vance Halder, kept the leash short, his grip firm and his jaw set in a way that suggested control mattered more to him than judgment. Elias noticed the way Halder's commands came clipped and sharp, not corrective, but dominating. The dog's tail was stiff. Its focus never softened. Elias slowed his pace. Something about the animal's posture unsettled him. The tension coiled too tight, as if waiting for permission to release. He glanced at Nolan, about to signal him to pause, but the moment passed too quickly. A group of travelers pushed between them and the exit corridor, forcing Nolan to shift his stance. Nolan stepped half a pace sideways, instinctively turning his body to shield Micah from a rolling suitcase that clipped the floor near his foot. His movement was subtle, protective, and unremarkable, except to the wrong eyes. Elias saw Halder's head snap toward them. He saw the leash tighten. For a brief second, Elias considered speaking. He weighed the cost of drawing attention against the risk of silence. The hall was full of uniforms, authority, cameras. He told himself that compliance avoided conflict, that restraint kept children safe. He chose quiet. The dog's breathing grew louder. Elias felt it then, the shift in the air, the invisible line being crossed before anyone acknowledged it. Nolan adjusted the carrier strap once more, unaware of the scrutiny fixed on him. Micah slept on, unaware of everything. Elias took one step forward, his mouth opening to intervene, but the sound of boots on tile and the tightening leash told him he was already too late to undo what restraint had invited. The hall felt ordinary, but every step forward tightened something unseen. The dog lunged. No growl, no bark, just the blur of muscle and teeth as the leash yanked taut and the animal snapped at Nolan's leg. The sound was sharp, a wet crunch of contact followed by Nolan's strained gasp. He staggered, but instinct overrode pain. One arm instinctively clutched tighter around the infant strapped to his chest. The other shot out to steady himself against a nearby pillar. Micah, startled awake by the jolt, released a piercing cry that cut through the terminal's noise like a blade. "Back! Back!" Vance Halder barked belatedly, yanking hard on the leash. The dog resisted for a second, ears flat, hackles raised, before retreating with a reluctant growl. Vance's face registered a flicker of panic before it hardened into manufactured authority. Nolan's leg buckled, blood seeping through his pants just above the knee. He didn't scream. His eyes, wide with shock, searched for his father even as he adjusted Micah's weight with trembling care. "Dad," Nolan choked out, his voice thin, caught between pain and confusion. Elias was already moving. He dropped the travel bag, stepped past the scattering bystanders, and knelt beside his son with deliberate control. One hand braced Nolan's shoulder, the other hovered over the injury without touching it. His face was calm, but behind his eyes, something sharpened. "I've got you," he said softly, eyes flicking up to assess Micah, who was wailing against Nolan's chest, his small fists pushing against the carrier straps. Elias gently adjusted the infant's head, soothing with a firm touch that masked the rising fire in his chest. Behind them, chaos thickened. Travelers backed away. Security officers appeared from adjacent gates, shouting over radios. A supervisor barked something about area lockdown. None of them moved to help. Vance stood rigidly, leash wrapped tightly around his wrist. "The subject made a sudden motion," he said aloud, as if narrating for a future report. K9 reacted accordingly. Elias didn't look at him. He was watching the overhead dome cameras, two of them, both with line of sight on the corridor. Good. Angle coverage would be key. He made a mental note of their exact positions, even as he pressed his handkerchief against Nolan's thigh to slow the bleeding. "Dad, I didn't do anything," Nolan murmured. His voice cracked, not from pain, but from the fear that he had somehow caused this, that he'd failed to protect Micah. "I know," Elias replied calmly. "Just breathe." Security staff finally surrounded them, not with aid, but with boundary-setting gestures, arms out, firm voices instructing others to move back. "Let us handle it." One officer stepped in with gloves, but didn't kneel. Another took statements from witnesses already being pulled aside, too fast, too fragmented. Elias stayed low, protective and still. "Is there a medic?" he asked, voice even. One man nodded and signaled. A pair of paramedics jogged into view, bags bouncing against their hips. But as they approached, they hesitated, looking first at the officers instead of the injured boy. "Don't wait," Elias said firmly, eyes locking with the lead medic. "He's bleeding." The medic knelt at last, unzipping the kit and cutting into Nolan's pants with practiced speed. The tear revealed a clean puncture wound, shallow but angry, already swelling. Nolan winced and looked away, jaw tight. Vance stepped closer, his voice rising slightly. "Handler Halder, ID 419. K9 identified a sudden turn. Subject was obstructing traffic and made an evasive motion. Dog engaged as trained." "Step back," Elias said, his voice low. The command wasn't loud, but it had weight. Vance faltered. For a second, the authority in his posture evaporated. Then it returned, forced. "This was protocol," Vance insisted. "No," Elias said, not looking up. "That was instinct, and poor control." The bystanders were watching now, some filming, some whispering. One man raised his phone openly, recording everything. Elias let him. Micah was whimpering again, lower now, as if confused by the cold air and the strange faces. Elias shifted, shielding him with his body, and gently slid the carrier strap from Nolan's shoulder. "I'll take him," he said. Nolan nodded, eyes glassy with pain. Elias lifted Micah carefully, nestling the infant against his own chest. The warmth of the child's body, the faint thump of his tiny heart, grounded him further. More supervisors entered the scene, including a tall man with clipped gray hair and a laminated ID swinging from his chest. Keel, Terminal Shift Commander. He began issuing orders without acknowledging Elias or Nolan. Officers repositioned. Someone began drafting a preliminary incident log. None of it included a statement from the family. "They're moving fast," Elias murmured, eyes following the cluster of uniforms conferring off to the side. "Too fast." "Dad," Nolan whispered, "they're not asking me anything." "I know," Elias replied. His mind was already assembling the outline of their approach. What would be said, what would be omitted, who would be blamed. This wasn't improvisation. It was protocol, but not the kind meant to protect people. One of the medics finally looked at him. "We should transport, sir. This leg will need deeper cleaning." Elias nodded. "Do it." As they helped Nolan onto a stretcher, Elias stood, rocking Micah gently. The baby's cries had faded to whimpers. Over Elias's shoulder, Vance met his eyes for the briefest moment. Something flickered, nervousness, or maybe calculation. Elias turned away without a word. He looked one last time at the cameras. They wanted the moment to pass, but Elias decided it would not. The medical team was already kneeling beside Nolan when Elias stepped forward, his stride calm but urgent, eyes trained not on the boy's leg but on the people taking notes around him. One nurse was wrapping Nolan's ankle with swift, practiced hands while another checked his pulse, murmuring something reassuring. Micah stirred against Nolan's chest, woken by the tension rather than the pain. Nolan winced but kept his grip on the soft carrier straps, refusing to let anyone else hold his brother. Blood seeped through the torn edge of his pant leg, but Nolan didn't cry. He just bit down, jaw tight, face pale, gaze flicking between his father and the officers a few feet away. Behind the perimeter hastily formed by transit staff and private security, Elias saw two uniformed men arguing over the wording of a report on a digital tablet. Their fingers flew, tapping too quickly. Elias noted it. Haste before accountability. He shifted his weight and leaned in close to Nolan. "How bad is it?" he asked softly, crouching low but keeping one eye on the perimeter. "It hurts, but I didn't fall," Nolan replied through clenched teeth. His arms held Micah protectively. "I didn't let him hit the baby." "You did exactly right," Elias said, voice low and steady. "And you're going to keep doing right no matter what they try to say." Nolan nodded, swallowing hard. One of the medics tried to persuade him to hand Micah off so they could move him to a gurney, but Elias stepped in. "He stays with his brother. You can treat him while he holds the infant. He's stable." The medic hesitated, then nodded. Elias turned his attention to the gathering of officials just outside the makeshift perimeter. That was when he noticed something subtle but disturbing. Witnesses, those who had been nearby when the dog lunged, were being moved one by one, pulled aside under the pretense of providing statements. But each was isolated, shuffled toward far corners of the hall, where unseen conversations were taking place out of earshot and out of frame. Elias's jaw tensed. That was not standard. Witness statements were usually collected in clusters when time was short. This wasn't management. It was orchestration. "Sir," came a crisp voice behind him. Elias stood as a tall man in a black uniform stepped forward. He was older than the others, with thinning silver hair and a voice that cut the air like a paper slit. His name badge read Branner Keel, Security Oversight Lead, the kind of man whose mere arrival was a signal. Keel extended a hand with mechanical politeness. "I'm Officer Keel. We're conducting an internal review of the incident. I've been asked to ensure your family is assisted appropriately while we gather preliminary reports." "Assisted?" Elias echoed without shaking his hand. "Then you'll have copies of those preliminary reports ready for me?" Keel's expression didn't falter. "They'll be made available through formal channels. At the moment, priority is medical care and de-escalation." Elias tilted his head. "And part of that involves preventing witnesses from remaining in view?" Keel gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We want to avoid further confusion. People are emotional after seeing something distressing." Elias didn't respond. He pulled out a slim notepad from his jacket and began noting down badge numbers, timestamps from the security console display above, and positions of officers. Not aggressively, just methodically. It was an act of quiet defiance. It said, "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to remember everything." A sudden movement near the edge of the hallway caught his attention. The dog, the same one that had bitten Nolan, was being led away by another handler. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement, just a quiet disappearance behind a service door. A removal, not for safety, but for optics. Elias turned back and found Nolan's eyes on him. His son had seen it too. "They're making it look like it never happened," Nolan said, voice low. Elias knelt again, pressing a hand to Nolan's shoulder. "Then we'll make sure they remember." Across the corridor, a security officer leaned toward a colleague and said something too low for Elias to hear, but the smirk that followed was clear. Elias didn't confront him. Instead, he marked his badge in his notepad. The treatment concluded quickly. The injury wasn't deep enough to require stitching, but the bruising and puncture marks were severe. Still, no one took photographs. No one cataloged the wound officially. Not the medics, not the handlers, not the officials. Elias asked twice. "We're not authorized to release internal media," one of them said flatly. But that wasn't the question he'd asked. Keel returned, clearing his throat. "We'd like to move your family to a quieter area to finish statements. There's a room nearby with more privacy." "To speak with witnesses?" Elias asked. "To give your son a moment to rest," Keel replied with the practiced air of a man used to ending conversations on his terms. Elias met Nolan's gaze. His son was exhausted, but alert. Micah had fallen asleep again, tiny fingers clinging to his brother's shirt. Elias gave a single nod. They followed. The room was small, sterile, and deliberately impersonal. Frosted glass, neutral chairs, a thin table. Elias noted there were no windows to the outside, only a muted ventilation fan. 2 guards remained posted just outside the door, not inside. That detail mattered. It wasn't for protection. It was for separation. Nolan sat carefully, Micah still bundled against him. Elias stood by the door, unmoving. For 10 long minutes, no one entered. No one asked questions. No one brought reports. They had been moved, then left. Not as a courtesy, as a tactic. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm and focused. "Tell me everything, Nolan. Start from the second you saw the dog." Nolan took a breath, steady but tight. "I was just shifting Micah. I wasn't doing anything wrong." "I know," Elias said, "but tell me everything anyway. The angle, the distance, the leash, Vance's hands, everything." So Nolan began. Elias listened, not just as a father, but as a strategist. Every pause was noted. Every small moment added to a mental timeline he would not let fade. He already knew what they were doing on the other side of that door, framing silence as compliance. But what they didn't know, what they always underestimated, was how memory could be sharper than any statement form. In the corner of the room, a dim camera lens blinked red. Active recording. Elias didn't mind. He stared at it. They thought separation would weaken him, but it sharpened his focus. Elias shut the door behind them with a quiet firmness, the latch clicking into place like a countdown beginning. The small room offered no comfort. Stale air, metal-framed chairs, and a surveillance camera nestled in one corner like an unblinking eye. Nolan stood in the middle, cradling Micah tightly, his posture stiff, jaw locked. The baby's soft cries had dwindled into hiccups, but Nolan's breathing hadn't steadied. Elias moved first, pulling out a chair and gesturing silently for his son to sit. He didn't ask if Nolan was okay. He already knew the answer and knew that asking would only worsen the wait. "We need to go over what happened," Elias said, his voice low, even. He sat across from Nolan, leaning in just enough to create a sense of safety, not pressure. Nolan's eyes flicked to the door, then back to his father. "I moved wrong," he muttered. "That's what did it. I shifted, and the dog thought, no, Elias interrupted gently but firmly. "That's not what did it. Dogs are trained to read intent. You didn't provoke. You shielded." His gaze held steady, grounding Nolan with its calm. "But Nolan looked down at Micah, now asleep again, his cheek pressed against his chest. "If I hadn't shifted, maybe it wouldn't have happened." Elias's expression softened, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his effort to stay composed. "Let me teach you something," he said, "about liability, about systems that train responses, not just dogs, but people too. What matters now isn't what you think you did, it's what actually happened, and we need to record every detail before it starts to fade." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notepad and pen. "Start from 5 seconds before the bite," he instructed. "What did you see? Hear? What did the dog do?" Nolan hesitated, then took the pen in one hand while keeping the other wrapped protectively around Micah. As he began to speak, Elias wrote quietly in parallel, mirroring and reinforcing his son's words. The room felt heavier with each sentence, not because of the trauma, but because of the clarity forming around it. Outside the frosted glass panel, shadows moved, officials conferring in hushed tones. Men who believed the family inside posed no threat. Elias knew better, knew that assumptions were already being made, that incident codes were being debated, that the story was being reshaped to protect the handlers and the institution before anyone asked for the truth. He could almost hear it. Aggressive body language, escalating behavior, unprovoked reaction, all the phrases designed to obscure responsibility. Elias leaned closer, steady in voice but steel underneath. "Do you remember the handler's face?" Nolan nodded slowly. "Yeah, Vance. He looked surprised. Not sorry, not even mad. Just like—" He trailed off, brow furrowing. "Like someone who expected it to happen," Elias finished. "That matters." He reached for his phone, tapping in a secure line and stepping to the far wall. After 2 rings, a male voice answered, measured, cautious. "Langston," Elias said quietly. "It's Elias Rourke. I need clarity on escalation procedures and public security incidents. And if there's a statute I should be reading tonight, tell me which one." "Is this personal or professional?" Langston asked. Elias's tone cooled. "It's both." Back at the table, Nolan gently rocked Micah, his body still tense but his focus steadier now. Elias returned to him, lowering himself with more purpose than fatigue. "Statutes?" Nolan asked, watching him. "You'll learn some new words," Elias said, "but don't worry. I'll teach you what they mean before someone else tries to twist them." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young male aide opened it halfway. "You're cleared to go," he said without emotion. "Staff will escort you out." "No report for us?" Elias asked flatly. "Internal process only," the aide replied, avoiding eye contact. "You can request documentation later." Elias didn't argue. He just nodded, helping Nolan up as he held Micah close again. The boy winced slightly, his leg stiffening from the untreated wound. Elias noted it, logged it. As they stepped into the hallway, an officer brushed past, pushing a cart that held the crate, the dog's crate. The animal was gone, already removed from sight, like the story never happened. They exited through a side door, bypassing the crowd entirely. No apology, no explanation, just the quiet efficiency of institutional forgetfulness. At the curb, Elias paused and looked back, eyes scanning the impassive terminal building. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft enough that only Nolan heard. "Some battles begin only after the doors close behind you." The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, thin, creased, and official. Elias Rourke opened it at the kitchen table without ceremony, scanning the letterhead of the Graymark Transit Incident Review Board before his eyes fell on the contents. His breath slowed. It took him less than 10 seconds to realize the summary was fiction dressed as formality. The subject attempted to shield the infant in a manner perceived as erratic movement, the report read. Canine unit responded to a perceived threat consistent with protocol. Minimal injury observed. No further action recommended. Elias set the paper down with the measured hands of someone resisting the urge to crush it. Across the table, Nolan sat beside Micah's high chair, spooning applesauce slowly into his baby brother's mouth. Nolan's leg was still bandaged beneath his sweatpants, but the pain had receded into a dull echo. His eyes flicked to the report. "That's not what happened," he said, his voice tight. "I know," Elias replied, already pulling his laptop closer. "They think it's over. That means they've underestimated us." The kitchen felt small suddenly, not cramped, but focused. The tick of the wall clock punctuated the silence as Elias began typing. His fingers moved with quiet fury, opening a spreadsheet to catalog every inconsistency. In one column, he listed the timeline as described in the report. In the next, the reality as he and Nolan had experienced it. Nolan stood, pulled out the folding chair beside him, and sat again, watching. "They said I moved erratically." "You shifted your weight to protect your brother," Elias said without looking up. "They translated that into justification." He turned the screen toward Nolan. "Look, this is how they collapse incidents. Ambiguity becomes excuse. Excuse becomes dismissal, and dismissal becomes policy." Nolan leaned forward, reading line by line. His mouth tightened as he reached the section describing his injury as minor skin abrasion. "That wasn't an abrasion," he said. "The doctor said the puncture missed the tendon by half an inch." Elias nodded. "Which is why we'll be getting that statement, signed and sealed, before they realize it matters." His next email was to Dr. Heron, the attending physician at the walk-in clinic they had visited the day after the incident. He worded it carefully. A request for an independent summary, not altered or influenced by the airport's risk division. His second email went to a local public records office initiating a request for CCTV footage timestamps from Graymark Terminal on the night of the attack. His third was to a freelance photojournalist he trusted, one who had covered transit policing before. Time, Elias knew, was the new enemy. Evidence had a way of evaporating once a case was closed. He printed the incident report and highlighted each misrepresentation in red, then handed the page to Nolan. "I want you to go through this line by line. Make notes. Not just what happened, what you thought, what you felt. We'll match their fiction with your clarity." Nolan nodded, serious now, no trace of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think they'll come after us for this?" Elias considered the question. "They'll try to ignore us first. If that doesn't work, they'll try to discredit us. That's why our next steps need to be precise." Micah let out a happy squeal, flinging applesauce with both fists. Elias caught a bit of it on his sleeve, smiling faintly despite the tension. That noise, cheerful, alive, reminded him of the real cost buried beneath all the paperwork. "They're not counting on us remembering," he said softly. "They're counting on us giving up." Over the next few hours, the house transformed into a quiet war room. The living room coffee table became a sorting center for scanned documents and witness notes. Elias drafted a templated affidavit form for anyone willing to give a statement and created a shared folder for storing interviews and photos. He mapped out a timeline, cross-referencing it with what he had already recorded in the terminal that night. Badge names, timestamps, audio clips saved on his phone. By evening, Nolan had practiced his statement 5 times, each version more confident than the last. Elias watched from across the room, noting the steadiness in his son's voice, the way he never stumbled on details. The pain in his leg hadn't slowed him, it had anchored him. "They rewrote what happened," Nolan said during the last run-through, his eyes fixed on the printed report beside him. "So, we're writing it back." Outside, dusk settled across the neighborhood. Porch lights flicked on in slow succession, one by one, like witnesses coming awake. Elias sat alone in his study, drafting the first formal notice of challenge addressed directly to the Portfield Security Commission. The tone was calm, surgical. He quoted procedural guidelines, referenced precedents, and requested an official correction to the public record. No accusations, just a demand for transparency. At the bottom of the page, he wrote the closing line. "We intend to proceed with the preservation of evidence in accordance with regional statute." He read the sentence twice, then hit print. The quiet hum of the machine filled the room, a small mechanical echo of something larger. In the silence that followed, Elias leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He wasn't rushing toward revenge. He was laying out his moves like a chessboard, each one visible, legal, and undeniable. Micah's baby monitor gave a soft beep. Nolan walked in a moment later, barefoot, holding the printed summary in one hand and his notes in the other. "I'm ready," he said. Elias looked up. "Then, so are we." He reached for the file folder, slid the documents inside, and snapped it shut. There would be obstacles ahead, denials, delays, maybe worse. But this moment was the line between being attacked and choosing to fight back. They marked the case closed, but Elias had just opened it. The Portfield Security Commission's email arrived without delay, but its contents were anything but routine. Elias Rourke read the opening line twice, then a third time. The reply didn't just reject his grievance, it carried a warning cloaked in formality. Frivolous or abusive misuse of public inquiry resources may result in administrative penalty. The sentence wasn't long, but it landed like a fist against glass. Cold, sharp, designed to crack resolve. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. Sunlight from the dining room window traced thin gold lines across the table, but there was no warmth in the moment. The message wasn't just a denial, it was a veiled threat, a dare, a signal that someone inside the system had made a decision. Push back, and you'll pay for it. Nolan's soft footsteps came down the hall behind him. The boy was limping more today, though he tried to hide it. Micah's light babble echoed faintly from the living room as he played with a rattle. The normalcy of it made the threat sting deeper. "Dad," Nolan called, stepping in. "Nurse Heller at school called, said someone phoned her office, asked about me." Elias turned slowly. "Asked what?" "She didn't say much, just that it felt weird, like they were trying to get her to say I was unstable or hard to manage. Said the questions didn't match what a school admin would ask." Elias's pulse quickened. This was retaliation, not overt, but precise. He stood, moving to the whiteboard he'd set up in the corner of the study. Names, timestamps, agencies, every line of inquiry he'd followed since the attack. He drew a red circle around Portfield Security Commission and added the word, pressure. "They're trying to create a narrative," Elias murmured, mostly to himself. "One where we're the disruption, not the victims." Without hesitating, he picked up his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't used in over a year. Darren Trask, civil liberties attorney. The man had once handled a canine abuse case that Elias cited during a policy debate at a transit safety forum. Back then, their connection was professional. Now, it had to be strategic. Trask answered after 2 rings. "Elias," he said, surprised but steady. "I heard something might have happened at Graymark. Yours?" "Mine, my son. The dog bit him. Handler claimed reaction to threat. We've filed reports, followed channels, and now they're circling us." "You didn't overstep?" "No," Elias replied, firm. "But I think they want me to." A pause. "I'm listening," Trask said, the tone shifting from casual to serious. Elias laid out the chain of events, the footage he'd seen, the internal movement of the dog, the silence that followed, the veiled threat from the commission, and now the strange call to Nolan's school. When he finished, Trask let the quiet stretch a beat too long. That handler. Vance Halder, Trask finally said. You're not the first. I represented a father 3 years ago. Similar bite, different terminal. His kid was 7. We were days away from filing when his employer suddenly offered him a generous promotion. In exchange for dropping everything. Quiet payoff. He took it. Elias's jaw clenched. So, there's a pattern. There is, and I've got files I wasn't allowed to use in court but can cite now under review provisions. This goes deeper than a bad dog handler. It's procedural failure protected by administrative shell games. Outside, Micah laughed. The sound was innocent, fragile. Elias turned toward the window but saw nothing but reflections. His own face tightened in focus. I want this built right, he said, steady. Not just a grievance, a legal firewall. I need enough pressure to expose the pattern, not just punish one man. You'll get retaliation, Trask warned. Insurance claim delays, job calls, maybe even fake behavioral flags. It's already started, Elias said. Micah's pediatrician just left a voicemail. Said the last visit came back flagged as questionable claim behavior. That's impossible. We've had no insurance issues until now. Trask swore softly under his breath. I'll send you a file drop tonight. Past incident logs, redacted affidavits. Start prepping your documentation. You'll need timeline integrity and chain of custody on everything. I've got them, Elias replied. Every document we touched since the bite, scanned, time-stamped, witness contact secured. And Elias, Trask hesitated. Whatever you do, don't trust Portfield to correct themselves. They've got too many contracts riding on silence. I'm not waiting for them to do the right thing, Elias said, voice quiet but hard. I just need them to keep pushing. The call ended. Elias sat in silence, one hand over his mouth, the other tapping the table slowly. He looked again at the Portfield Commission's email, its sterile language, the strategic vagueness, the attempt to intimidate without being actionable. He forwarded the entire chain to Trask, then opened a new document titled Legal Shield Protocol, Phase 1. He copied over Micah's claim delay notice, added Nolan's school report, and began writing a summary of each retaliatory move. Every entry had a time, date, and context. He treated it like a blueprint, because it was. Elias didn't want revenge. He wanted a system that couldn't pretend it didn't know. And now he had proof that the system wasn't just broken, it was actively resisting repair. He walked into the living room where Nolan sat holding Micah, the infant giggling as he pulled at his brother's hoodie string. They're coming at us from every angle, Elias said softly. Nolan looked up, not with fear, but something closer to clarity. So we hit every angle back? Elias nodded, a small smile flickering. Exactly. He picked up his laptop and returned to his workspace. Behind him, Micah's laughter continued, sharp and clear like the bell that marks the end of silence. They weren't just denying the truth, they were trying to erase it. The anonymous file arrived with no warning. Elias Rourke sat in the quiet of his home office, light from a desk lamp casting long shadows across the floor, when the alert pinged. It was a simple encrypted link, sent from an untraceable address. He hesitated only a moment before opening it. As the video loaded, grainy bodycam footage blinked to life. The timestamp read 11:48 p.m., minutes after the incident. Got the little punk good, a voice muttered, followed by a low chuckle. Dogs know who to bite. It's like they smell it. Elias's jaw locked. The voice was unmistakable. Vance Halder. There was no tension in the handler's voice. No regret. Just arrogance, coated in laughter. Off-screen, another man, unidentified, let out a dry laugh in response. The video ended with footsteps walking away from what sounded like the cordoned hallway outside Graymark's East Terminal. Elias clicked replay. Then again. Each time, the words hit harder. This wasn't mishandling. It was intent. And intent changed everything. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Across the room, Nolan sat reading a school report, one leg propped on a cushioned stool. Micah's soft breathing came from the next room. Elias watched the stillness a moment longer, then stood. By morning, the campaign began. He filed 3 FOIA requests by sunrise, targeting Arkvale's internal K-9 certifications, Sentinel-9's operational clearance logs, and all handler incident reports tied to Halder in the last 5 years. Trask helped fine-tune the language, citing public safety interest to override potential redactions. A separate request went to the Portfield Commission for the internal chain of communication that followed the attack. Elias wasn't hunting rumors anymore. He was building legal structure. Next came the media. He reached out to Raylan Merrick, an independent journalist known for exposing wrongful detainments in transit hubs, and Calder Voss, a quiet but persistent columnist for the Writ Ledger. Both had reputations for persistence and caution, traits Elias valued now more than ever. Within 48 hours, Merrick responded, requesting a sit-down and source verification. "I won't run anything without your consent," Merrick promised. His tone was professional but curious, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "But if what you're holding is real, this could open a lot more than just one handler's record." "It's real," Elias said, sliding a sealed drive across the table. "And it's not about one man. It's about a culture." Meanwhile, Trask had unearthed something damning. Sentinel-9, the K-9 unit Halder led, had been operating under a provisional license, one that had technically expired 3 months prior to the attack. A backlog of federal inspection reports had delayed the formal review, but the expiration meant that the unit's field deployments were, at best, legally vulnerable. "We can hit them federally," Trask said, eyes gleaming with controlled urgency. "If they acted under lapsed authorization and injured a minor, especially near an infant, this isn't just misconduct. It's gross negligence tied to federal liability statutes." The strategy emerged: trigger a review at the federal level, force a compliance audit, and then, once the system exposed itself, present the footage. They wouldn't have to shout. The system would indict itself. But Arkvale was already maneuvering. 2 days after the FOIA requests were filed, Vance Halder was reassigned from active patrol duty to administrative support. It was not suspension, but a demotion without public announcement. Damage control in real time. "Temporary containment," Trask muttered. "They're hoping the news cycle will choke this down." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Nolan. "Do you want to help me tell them?" he asked. Nolan, who'd been quietly watching news clips of other dog attacks for comparison, looked up. "You mean, speak?" Elias nodded. "Reporters, maybe an audience. People will want to know what it felt like. They'll want to hear from someone who was there." There was a long silence. Nolan rubbed the back of his neck, uncertainty flickering in his expression. "What if I mess up?" "You won't," Elias said, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "And even if you do, the truth will carry more weight than their polish ever could." They practiced every night. Short statements, honest details, no drama, just clarity. Nolan's voice shook at first, but it grew steadier as the days passed. Then the twist arrived. A knock came late one evening, a private courier. No badge, no return address. Inside the package, a second body cam file. This time, the footage showed the moments immediately before the dog lunged. The handler's hand was visibly tense on the leash, no attempt made to redirect the canine as it growled low, tracking Nolan's steps. "He's moving too fast," a muffled voice said, Vance's. "Might give the mutt a reason." Elias didn't flinch. He forwarded the footage to Trask. "We're holding a press conference." Trask hesitated. "That'll escalate things fast." "That's the point." They booked a modest hall downtown. No corporate sponsor, no political tie-in. Just a plain room with metal chairs, a projection screen, and a row of mics. Voss agreed to moderate. Nolan would stand beside Elias. Trask would outline the legal violations. The evidence would play in sequence: dog bite, injury photos, body cam audio, the expired license documents. As the final preparations were made, Elias sat with Micah quietly on his lap, the toddler too young to understand what his family was preparing to expose. But Elias understood. So did Nolan, now standing straighter, rehearsing lines not to perform, but to testify. Elias stepped outside for air, eyes scanning the evening sky. They gave him silence. He answered with sound. The handler smirked, confident his dog's aggression would go unchallenged, unaware that every move, every witness, and every second had already been anticipated by a father with the law on his side. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets unstoppable authority, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The first questions came before the microphone was even switched off. Elias Rourke stood behind the plain wooden podium at the front of the rented hall, his posture steady, his eyes calm. Beside him stood Nolan, leaning slightly on his good leg, Micah absent but very much present in the weight of what was about to be said. Darren Trask adjusted the stack of documents on the table behind them, preparing to lay out what Arkvale Protection Systems had hoped would never be uncovered. The incident at Greymark Transit Hub, Elias began, voice measured, was not an isolated moment of canine misjudgment. It was the predictable result of an unchecked system, one that chose silence over safety and deflection over decency. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. Behind the trio, a projector flickered to life. The first image shown was the bite, high resolution, time-stamped, medically authenticated. Then came Nolan's scanned treatment report, followed by the clip, grainy audio captured by a retired officer's body cam. The voice of handler Vance Halder played clearly over the room's speakers, biting through the air with chilling ease. "They know who to bite," Vance's voice crackled, laughing lightly to another officer. "You don't even have to train them too hard." A few gasps. A few reporters turned pale. One lowered his camera, suddenly not sure whether documenting this felt appropriate anymore. Trask stepped forward. That statement wasn't recorded weeks later. It was captured moments after Nolan Rourke, a minor, was bitten while carrying his infant brother. What you just heard is not accidental cruelty. It's policy clothed in sarcasm. Elias stepped back as the questions erupted. He answered each one not with fire, but with clarity. One reporter asked if this was a vendetta. "This isn't about revenge," Elias said calmly. "It's about prevention." Nolan didn't speak much, but when a younger journalist nervously asked how the bite had changed him, he simply said, "I'm not afraid of dogs. I'm afraid of silence." By noon, the footage had aired on 3 national news networks. By sundown, clips had gone viral, stitched together with headlines like "Canine Control" or "Institutional Neglect," and "Father Refuses to Let the System Bite Twice." The story began pulling weight beyond its borders. Civil liberties advocates shared it. Legal commentators analyzed it. School parents from Greymark sent messages of support. But perhaps the clearest indicator of impact came just after midnight. Arkvale Protection Systems released an official statement, dry, sterile, and full of legal fog. They deeply regretted any perception of harm and were reviewing protocols to ensure greater safety in the future. But the stock market spoke more truthfully. Their value dropped 9% within 2 hours of the press conference airing, with whispers of contract reevaluation spreading across logistics networks. The next morning, Trask received a scrambled voicemail on a burner line. A man's voice, nervous, masked by ambient fan noise, said, "I work inside Arkvale. I've seen the real training logs. If I hand them over, I want immunity. Total immunity." The voice hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a match. Trask played the voicemail for Elias in his office. "Internal records," he said, pausing. "Training logs. It means they kept something off the books." Elias nodded slowly. "Then we let them write their own confession. We just sign the bottom." That evening, as Trask began drafting the framework for a federal civil rights lawsuit citing both excessive force and child endangerment, a message popped into Elias's inbox. It was from a father in Loringdale, a small city hundreds of miles away. The subject line read, "Same handler, same dog, same silence." Attached were photos: a teenage boy, a stitched leg, a hospital intake form dated 8 months earlier, the handler's name, V. Halder. Elias stared at the screen, not speaking. Nolan stepped into the room quietly behind him, carrying Micah, now giggling as he reached for the ceiling light. Elias turned to his son. "We're not alone," he said simply. The second family stepped forward publicly 3 days later. Their statement was brief but powerful. They had been paid off to remain quiet, their son made to sign a non-disclosure agreement he hadn't understood. But now they wanted in. They wanted the truth known. News outlets pounced. The pattern was undeniable. Dots were no longer isolated. They were forming a map. Arkvale tried to stay silent, but silence was no longer an option. They trained the dog to attack. Elias trained the truth to bite back. They caught it just in time. Elias Rourke sat in his home office when the alert came through, an automated ping from the hospital's patient portal. It was a simple notification. "Your child's medical file has been updated." At first, it didn't seem alarming. Routine insurance paperwork, perhaps. But something gnawed at him. With quiet precision, he opened the file, eyes scanning each field. Under the section titled Incident Origin, a new note had been inserted. It read, "Child presented to medical team following a physical altercation initiated by the family during a terminal security dispute." Elias froze. The wording was deliberate, clinical, vague, but deadly in implication. It subtly reframed the attack on Nolan and the infant Micah as a response to the family's own behavior. A planted seed. If left unchallenged, it could blossom into doubt, infecting every legal and public narrative. He took a slow breath, thumb hovering over his phone's screen before tapping in the number for Darren Trask. "Trask?" came the lawyer's gruff voice. "They're trying to tamper with Micah's file," Elias said, steady but taut. "Hospital record. Someone added a line that suggests we provoked the attack." Silence crackled on the other end for a moment. "I'll subpoena the revision history," Trask replied sharply. "We'll get the digital signature and timestamp. You caught it early? 15 minutes ago. It's recent. Then we're lucky, but it means they're scared." The call ended, but Elias didn't move from his seat. His eyes remained on the screen. In the corner of the file interface was a small button, Request Amendment. His finger hovered, then pressed it. The request wasn't just about the file. It was about control, about reminding the system it was being watched. 3 days later, federal investigators swept into Arkvale's Regional Operations Center. Trucks rolled in just after dawn, marked with neutral insignia. But everyone at the Graymark Transit Hub knew exactly who they were. Agents in gray suits filed inside with sealed warrants, accessing every terminal, server rack, and file archive. Logs were pulled. Training footage was duplicated. Every handler's evaluation record, every canine deployment report, every video from the night of the attack confiscated. Elias didn't attend the raid. He didn't need to. He had already given his statement, not as a complainant, but as a federal witness. That shift from petitioner to contributor was subtle but seismic. It meant his voice had weight now. It meant someone finally listened. At Nolan's school, an unexpected assembly was called. Students gathered in the gym under the premise of a civic engagement talk. The principal, Mr. Halver, stood at the podium, speaking of integrity, courage, and standing firm in the face of injustice. He never said Nolan's name. He didn't have to. The message rippled through the student body regardless, and when Nolan returned to class, no one mocked his limp or asked about the scar anymore. They just nodded. Silent respect. Back at Arkvale, handler Vance Halder's name disappeared from the personnel roster. Internal queries led nowhere. His email returned auto-replies. The silence around him was strategic, clearly orchestrated. Then, late one night, Trask forwarded Elias a classified update. Vance had been suspended pending a criminal review. Not fired, not charged, just placed into the institutional shadows. They'll try to reassign him once it blows over, Trask warned. This is their playbook. I'm not here to watch the same book close again, Elias replied. As the legal pressure escalated, so did the reach of the system's resistance. A cryptic message arrived in Elias's legal inbox, a thinly veiled accusation that his filings were burdening public resources. Trask chuckled when he read it. They're flinching, he said, threats dressed up as policy concerns. But the true twist came unexpectedly from within the political sphere. Senator Darian Calvin, a junior lawmaker known more for infrastructure bills than social reform, gave a speech during a Transit Oversight Committee hearing. Elias watched it from his tablet, not expecting much. But then the senator leaned forward and tapped his notes. "Let me tell you about a child named Micah," Calvin said, "an infant, barely old enough to sit up, who became collateral damage in a system that failed to separate security from aggression. His brother was bitten. His father stayed calm. But the system responded not with care, but with a cover-up. That ends now." The chamber fell quiet. Calvin introduced a draft proposal, Micah's Measure. Its purpose to prohibit the use of security canines within designated child safe zones in all federally funded transit terminals. The measure included penalties for violations, audit requirements, and third-party oversight. It wasn't sweeping reform, but it was a start. A crack in the wall. Elias watched from his living room, Micah curled against his side, unaware of the world tilting around his name. Nolan sat across from them, quiet, his eyes locked on the screen. "They're talking about us," he said softly. "They're talking about what we refuse to let be forgotten," Elias corrected. The lawsuit was still pending. The court dates lay ahead, but the war had shifted arenas, from courtrooms and corridors to policy chambers and media screens. And Elias understood something clearly now. This wasn't just his fight anymore. He stood, carefully adjusting Micah's blanket as the boy slept soundly against his chest. They bit the wrong family and left teeth marks on history. The courtroom fell silent as the footage began. There were no warnings in the video, just the sudden lurch of the canine and Nolan's startled cry as the teeth tore through his pant leg and into flesh. The sound of Micah's wail, shrill and disoriented, cut through the room like a siren. For a moment, the court was not a room of polished oak and high ceilings. It was the corridor again, charged with confusion, pain, and something cold underneath. Indifference. Elias Rourke sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, shoulders squared, eyes forward, fingers interlocked. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, not for victory, but for control. Across from him, Arkvale's legal team whispered among themselves, feigning calm, but the tension in their eyes betrayed deeper currents. The judge, a stern man named Herrick Lorne, nodded for the next exhibit. The leaked audio rolled, handler Vance Halder's voice crackled to life. "Dogs know who to bite. They feel things. You don't teach that. You let them work." Gasps were audible. The court reporter paused, glancing up as if to confirm what he'd just transcribed. Then the voice of Nolan Rourke echoed through the chamber. "I was standing still," Nolan said from the witness stand, his tone composed but resolute. "Micah was asleep. I wasn't provoking anyone. I didn't even know the dog was close." His hands gripped the railing in front of him, white-knuckled but steady. He looked older than his 16 years in that moment, not because of age, but because of gravity, the kind only truth could give someone. He lunged, Nolan continued. I twisted to shield my brother. I didn't fall because I didn't want to hurt him. The judge leaned forward. And did anyone assist you immediately? No, Your Honor. My dad did. The security team told the crowd to back up. That was their priority. Not me, not Micah. The prosecutor nodded, stepping aside. Then came the twist. Vance Halder was called to the stand, subpoenaed, not invited. His uniform was gone. In its place, a plain suit, 2 sizes too big for his frame. He looked drained, jaw tight, mouth a thin line. As he raised his right hand and took the oath, Elias watched without emotion. This was no longer personal. It was structural. Under questioning, Halder tried to minimize. He stumbled over dates, phrasing, tone. But when pressed about Arkvale's policies, his defenses began to crack. I was told to let the dog assert presence, he muttered, especially in heavy-foot traffic zones. Even if children were nearby? The prosecutor asked. Vance hesitated. The courtroom leaned forward. Yes, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. The directive came from Operations Director Marin Voss. The silence that followed was crushing. Elias exhaled through his nose slowly, the confirmation clicking every foreshadowed piece into place. This wasn't recklessness. It was doctrine. Engineered aggression behind a badge and a leash. The judge cleared his throat. This matter will proceed to full federal investigation. All related Arkvale policies will be examined, and supervisory personnel will be summoned. The gavel did not fall with vengeance. It landed with the weight of accountability. Elias remained seated, unmoved. His son had testified. The truth had surfaced. And now, the system had no choice but to look itself in the mirror. He didn't want vengeance. He wanted the truth too solid to erase. The email came first. No subject line. Just a quiet ping in Elias's inbox at 7:43 a.m. Flagged, Urgent Review. The sender was a junior investigative reporter at the Braylon Ledger, attaching scanned PDFs from a decade-old civil case. Arkvale Protection Systems had paid out $96,000 to a family whose toddler had been knocked over by a patrol dog near a stadium checkpoint. The settlement was sealed. Elias clicked through each page, his jaw tightening, not at the number but at the pattern. There was no mention of retraining, no record of discipline, just payout, privacy, and silence. It wasn't the first. It wouldn't be the last. By noon, 3 national media outlets had picked up the story. Headlines pulsed across screens in Graymark. Arkvale accused of suppressing K-9 attack settlements. Security firm under fire as new footage surfaces. The bite behind the badge. Elias watched from his office, not triumphant, but vigilant. Public interest was no longer a wave, it was a tide. He remained seated as his phone buzzed again and again with panel invitations, podcast requests, advocacy offers. He declined each one. This wasn't a moment for speeches. The case needed clarity, not sound bites. In the corner of his home office, Nolan knelt on the carpet, coaxing Micah across a short stretch of floor. Micah took a wobbly step, then another, squealing as he reached his brother's arms. Nolan laughed, a real laugh, then instinctively glanced toward Elias as if needing permission to feel joy again. Elias didn't speak. He just nodded once, eyes softening. That moment said more than any press conference could. They were still moving forward, together. Later that evening, Trask arrived with something heavy in his coat pocket. He dropped it on the table with a soft thud, a stapled packet of Arkvale's Federal Service Agreement. One clause, Trask said, changed everything. If they're found guilty of gross misconduct, Trask explained, voice low, they're barred from any public service contracts for 10 years. Transportation, defense, postal, education, all of it. Elias read the clause twice, then a third time. His mind processed it not as hope, but as leverage. It was the kind of detail bureaucracies buried, but that strategists unearthed. It wasn't just about Handler Vance anymore. It was about a system that thought it was untouchable. "What's our trigger?" Elias asked, setting the document down. "Federal ruling of liability or criminal negligence," Trask replied. "We're halfway there." In a quiet corner of Graymark Hub, away from reporters, the Senate Committee on Transportation met in closed session. A staffer read aloud a revised draft of Micah's Measure, a bill proposing clear restrictions on K-9 units operating near children. It included a provision to create independent oversight for K-9 handler certification and a mandatory child safety buffer zone at all major transit hubs. The committee chair, a skeptical man named Dornell Carvis, tapped his pen on the table. "We're not just reacting emotionally here, right?" he said. "We're talking enforceable policy." Another senator spoke up. "We're talking about a baby in a carrier, Senator, and a teenage brother who got bit trying to shield him." Carvis didn't argue again. Within 2 days, the bill passed preliminary approval with bipartisan support. The public hadn't seen Elias's face, but they'd seen Micah's. A toddler's profile photo, strapped to his brother's chest, had been quietly circulated with permission. The image said everything. It wasn't about outrage. It was about decency. At home, Elias sat by the window, watching Micah toddle along the edge of the couch. Nolan hovered protectively nearby, still flinching at any loud bark from a neighbor's yard. The boy had stopped going to the park, wouldn't walk past the security office at school, wouldn't even touch the family's old dog collar from their previous pet. The trauma was quiet, but constant. "Dad," Nolan said one evening, standing in the doorway of Elias's office, "do I have to talk to them again?" Elias turned in his chair. "Only if you want to." "I do. Just, sometimes I think I won't say it right." Elias stood, walked over, and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "The truth doesn't have to be perfect," he said. "It just has to be yours." Micah made a noise behind them, another wobbly step, another proud squeal. Nolan turned instinctively and smiled. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo. It wasn't staged, it wasn't polished, but it was real. That photo would later sit in Elias's office just above a copy of the Senate draft of Micah's Measure. The caption was handwritten on the frame, "Still moving forward." Outside their home, reporters continued knocking, but Elias didn't answer. Not yet. The case still had to be won in court. Trask reminded him that Arkvale's defense team was shifting tactics, blaming unclear protocol, contractor miscommunication, and handler overreach. "They're trying to isolate Vance," Trask warned. "Make him the fall guy." Elias was unmoved. "Then we show the system that trained the fall." That night, after Micah had been tucked into bed and the lights dimmed, Elias opened his laptop. The screen glowed faintly as he watched a live-stream replay of the Senate vote. Carvis's voice echoed through the chamber, dull but clear. "With 61 in favor, 37 opposed, the measure passes to the floor." Elias didn't cheer. He just sat back, breath steady, shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time in weeks. Outside, wind stirred the trees. In the hallway, Nolan walked past quietly, a blanket in hand, glancing into Micah's room to check on him. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. They took one step forward, and Micah's next steps carried them both. Arkvale's final play came wrapped in silence. In the closing hours before the last courtroom session, a sealed envelope arrived at Elias Rourke's legal counsel's office. Darren Trask read it first, his fingers tightening as he flipped through the pages. He didn't speak immediately. Elias watched him from across the polished oak table inside the federal courthouse consultation room, the air tense with the smell of old paper, sanitizer, and something metallic, perhaps expectation. Trask finally looked up, jaw tight. "They're offering a settlement," he said. "A large one, 7 figures, with a full NDA clause." Elias didn't blink. "Of course they are," he replied, voice calm but cold. He took the envelope, read the terms himself. Generous on paper. Monetary relief, expedited processing, even a private letter of regret. But not a single word of accountability. No apology. No admission. Just money in exchange for silence. He looked at Nolan, sitting across the room with one leg folded over the other, a scar still faintly visible beneath the hem of his pants. Micah, too young to understand, was with a caretaker elsewhere. Elias placed the envelope back on the table. "Tell them no," he said, standing slowly. "We didn't come this far to be bought." Minutes later, the courtroom filled. There was an unusual weight in the air. The gallery was packed, not just with reporters but with legal observers, members of advocacy groups, and off-duty officers watching in uneasy silence. At the bench, the federal judge, a stern man with sharp eyes named Harvin Kell, called the session to order. Elias's pulse remained steady. The hearing began with final statements. Trask was measured, direct. This is no longer just about a dog bite. It is about a deliberate pattern of systemic neglect, concealed injuries, silenced victims, and a command culture that enabled both. The evidence is clear. The defendant had the power to prevent it and chose silence instead. The opposing counsel, a suited man named Maris Dunn, tried to shift the frame. While unfortunate, the incident reflects isolated misjudgments. Ark Vale maintains Elias barely heard the rest. His focus was on the rows behind Dunn, where two former Ark Vale employees sat, whistleblowers who had stepped forward only days earlier. One of them, a former operations manager named Cale Drenner, had released a trove of internal memos proving executive-level awareness of prior K-9-related injuries. Those memos now sat in evidence folders before the judge. "Mr. Halder," Judge Kell said, turning to the now disgraced handler brought in under subpoena, "you are not on trial today, but you will answer truthfully. Did your superiors give you verbal or written instructions regarding the use of the K-9 unit around children?" Vance Halder, looking smaller than he ever had, nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. We were told the dogs were to maintain presence in high-density zones. I voiced concern once, but I was told not to question procedures. And were you ever told to ignore reactions from families?" Halder hesitated. "Yes." It was a quiet bomb. A dozen pens stopped moving. The judge tapped the bench twice, then leaned forward. "Thank you. That will be sufficient." The final judgment was delivered without pause. Ark Vale Protection Systems is hereby ordered to pay compensatory damages to the Rourke family, totaling $2.7 million. More importantly, the court finds gross negligence, institutional misconduct, and willful endangerment. I hereby refer the Operations Director, Mr. Janik Koren, for federal perjury charges. The company is disqualified from holding federal transportation or security contracts for no less than 10 years. A hum swept through the courtroom. Elias didn't move. Trask exhaled softly. Nolan looked down at his hands, folded tightly in his lap. The judge wasn't done. Handler Vance Halder is hereby sentenced to 2 years probation, with mandatory psychological evaluation and future restriction from public canine handling roles. This court expects the agencies present to enact immediate reforms to prevent recurrence of these events. Then silence. True silence. The judge nodded once more and prepared to adjourn. Before he could, Trask rose. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "with your permission, Nolan Rourke would like to make a brief statement." Judge Kell tilted his head. "Granted." Nolan stood. At 16, he carried himself with quiet composure. He stepped forward, placed both hands on the wooden railing before him, and took a breath. "I want to thank the court," he began. "But more than that, I want to thank my father for protecting us, for fighting back, and for never letting the bite define our silence." The room stilled. Even Dunn looked away. A reporter dropped his pen. The words, simple and clean, carried heavier than any verdict. Justice wasn't loud, but it echoed. They wanted a signature to end it. Elias wanted a signature that others could begin from. Elias stood just outside the newly rebuilt east terminal of Graymark Hub, the wind brushing softly against the collar of his coat. The sharp smell of fresh concrete and polished steel still lingered in the air, blending with the distant scent of jet fuel. Behind him, travelers streamed through the automatic glass doors, unaware of the storm this ground once held. In front of him, a modest bronze plaque had been installed at chest height on a stone pedestal near the entrance. In honor of those who guard without violence, the Micah Standard. He read the inscription once, then again, not because he needed to, but because its existence still felt surreal. Nolan stepped up beside him, walking evenly now without a limp. His stride was steady, not cautious. There was no bandage wrapped around his leg, no grimace hidden behind his lips. A quiet strength had returned, but Elias could tell that certain scars ran deeper than skin. Beside Nolan toddled Micah, who now moved with the delightful unpredictability of a curious child. He clutched 2 fingers of Nolan's right hand and pulled toward the glass wall that looked out over the runway. Planes taxied slowly under an overcast sky, their movements catching the toddler's eyes like blinking toys in motion. "They've repainted the whole East Corridor," Nolan said quietly, his voice low and unreadable. "No dogs in sight." Elias didn't respond right away. His gaze lingered on a uniformed guard posted near the inner checkpoint, a man without a canine, who offered a calm nod to a family passing by. Subtle, but new. The shift wasn't loud, but it was real. "You know what they call it now?" Nolan asked, gesturing vaguely inside. "The Rourke Protocol." Elias's lips curved faintly. "Didn't think they'd actually name it after us." "They didn't. They named it after what we forced them to see," Nolan replied, tightening his grip on Micah's hand as the boy tried to lunge toward the terminal doors again. "You just gave them no place to hide." Inside the terminal, a different kind of order pulsed through the space. More signs. Wider family lanes. No dogs patrolling crowded sections, just posted observation points and a designated child clear zone beyond the arrival funnel. The new policies had reshaped Graymark, but it was the invisible culture, quieter security, more empathy, more eyes trained on people rather than leashes, that marked the truer change. Elias didn't walk forward yet. His eyes drifted to the side, where a familiar man in a long gray coat leaned against a railing near the car drop-off zone. Darren Trask didn't wave, but gave a slight incline of the head. Enough. Trask had always been a man of few words and clear outcomes. Their work was largely finished now. The lawsuit had closed. The reforms had passed. The public memory had already begun to shift, away from scandal, toward structure. "Micah just wanted to see airplanes today," Elias finally said, crouching slightly as his youngest gave a joyful squeal at a taxiing jet's roar. "He doesn't remember what happened here. I don't want him to." Nolan nodded. "I do, but I also remember what came after." A silence passed between them, but it wasn't empty. Nolan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thin, sealed envelope. He placed it in Elias's hand gently, his tone softer now. "You never asked for this, but I thought maybe you should have it anyway." Elias raised an eyebrow but didn't open it yet. "What is it?" "Just a picture," Nolan said, watching Micah begin to toddle in circles nearby. "The courtroom, that moment when the judge read the ruling. You were standing still, hands folded, no press, no noise, just there." Elias turned the envelope over slowly, his fingers pressing against the slight ridge of the photograph inside. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he looked back at the terminal, at the clean windows, the wide-open spaces, the subtle absence of threat. He knew this moment wasn't a conclusion. It was a marker, a pause in motion. The real victory was never the plaque, never the courtroom win, never the legislation. It was seeing Nolan stand tall. It was Micah laughing without fear. It was the choice not to let rage define them. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, negligence, and the power of accountability through legal action. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, responsibility, and protecting the vulnerable.